The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital flickered with a clinical, uncaring coldness that matched the mood in the Level 1 trauma ward. At the center of the storm was Clara. She was small, moved with a silent, ghost-like efficiency, and rarely spoke more than 3 words at a time. To the veteran nurses who had spent 20 years hardening their hearts, Clara was a target. They called her, the mouse. They mocked her soft-spoken nature, whispered about her lack of backbone in the break room, and dumped the most grueling, thankless shifts on her shoulders. They assumed her silence was weakness, never realizing that the loudest souls often have the least to prove. Head nurse Miller, a woman who measured worth by the volume of one's voice, took a particular interest in breaking Clara. She would bark orders, intentionally reassign Clara's patients, and roll her eyes when Clara spent extra time sitting by the bedsides of the elderly or the dying. "This is a trauma ward, Clara, not a Sunday school," Miller would sneer. "If you can't handle the pressure, go work in a library. We need warriors here, not wallflowers." Clara would simply nod, her eyes calm and unreadable, and return to her work. She never defended herself. She never complained. She just kept her hands moving, steady, precise, and hauntingly experienced. The breaking point for the staff's patients came on a Tuesday afternoon. The ward was over capacity, and a minor mistake in the pharmacy logs led Miller to explode at Clara in front of the entire surgical team. "You're useless," Miller shouted, her voice echoing off the tile walls. "You don't have the grit for this. You're just a quiet little girl playing dress-up in scrubs." The other nurses watched, some with pity, others with a cruel smirk. Clara didn't flinch. She just looked at Miller and said, "The noise doesn't save the patient, ma'am. The work does." Before Miller could retort, the building began to vibrate. It started as a low hum in the floorboards, a rhythmic thrumming that grew into a window-rattling roar. The hospital sat near the coast, but it wasn't a designated flight path for civilian life flights. Suddenly, the emergency radio in the trauma bay screeched to life with a frequency the staff had never heard. "Priority Zulu. This is Ghost Rider 1 to 4. We are 3 minutes out. Ground clearance is non-negotiable. We are bringing in a high-value asset. Clear the pad or we clear it for you." The voice on the radio wasn't a dispatcher, it was a man who sounded like he was shouting through a storm. Panic erupted. The administrative staff scrambled, Miller started screaming for the security team, and the senior doctors looked bewildered. No one knew how to handle a priority Zulu. Amidst the chaos, Clara moved. She didn't run, she transitioned. Her posture shifted, her shoulders squared, and the mouse vanished. She walked to the supply closet, punched in a code no one knew she had, and began pulling out specialized tactical trauma kits that the hospital kept for extreme emergencies, kits most of the staff didn't even know how to open. "What are you doing?" Miller yelled, grabbing Clara's arm. "Stay out of the way." Clara didn't pull away, she simply looked at Miller with a gaze so cold it stopped the older woman's breath. "Get the crash cart, get the O-negative blood units, and get out of my light," Clara said. Her voice wasn't soft anymore. It was steel. The sound outside became deafening as a massive Navy Seahawk helicopter, charcoal gray and unmarked, hovered over the hospital's small helipad. It didn't wait for a slow descent. It dropped. As the skids hit the concrete, 4 men in full tactical gear, soaked in sea spray and blood, leapt out before the rotors even slowed. They weren't carrying a standard stretcher, they were carrying a man on a carbon fiber combat litter. They bypassed the security doors, moving with a terrifying, synchronized speed that left the hospital staff frozen in the hallways. The lead commando, a giant of a man with a beard caked in salt and a face etched with grief, burst into the trauma bay. "Where is she?" he roared, his eyes scanning the room like a predator. Miller stepped forward, trembling. "Sir, you can't be in here, this is a restricted." The commando ignored her entirely. His eyes locked onto Clara, who was already standing by the primary surgical table, her gloves on, her face a mask of absolute command. "Chief," the commando gasped, his voice breaking. "We got hit in the extraction. It's Elias. He's fading." The ward went silent. The mouse stepped forward, and the 4 elite SEALs, men who looked like they could level the building, instinctively stepped back to give her room. They didn't look at the doctors. They didn't look at the head nurse. They looked at Clara with a reverence that bordered on worship. "Get him on the table," Clara commanded. As they moved, she began shouting orders that left the surgeon speechless. She wasn't using civilian medical terms, she was using battlefield triage coding. She was calling out vitals before the monitors were even hooked up. For the next 3 hours, the trauma ward became a theater of impossible skill. Clara didn't just assist, she led. When the lead surgeon's hands shook at the sight of the jagged shrapnel near the femoral artery, Clara stepped in. She worked with a terrifying, rhythmic beauty, her hands moving faster than the eye could follow, stopping bleeds that should have been fatal. The SEALs stood guard at the door, silent as statues, their eyes never leaving Clara. Every time Miller or another nurse tried to intervene, one of the commandos would simply shift their weight, a silent warning that this was Clara's domain now. When the sun began to set, the monitors finally emitted a steady, healthy beep. The soldier on the table, a young man who looked barely 20, took a deep, ragged breath. He was stable. Clara stepped back, her scrub soaked in blood, her face pale with exhaustion. She walked over to the giant commando who had carried him in. She didn't say a word. She just placed a hand on his armored shoulder. The man, who looked like he hadn't cried in a decade, collapsed into a chair and put his head in his hands, whispering, "Thank you, document. Thank you." The truth came out in the quiet hours of the night. Clara wasn't just a nurse. She was a retired lieutenant commander, a decorated Navy combat medic who had served 3 tours with the SEAL teams. She had saved dozens of lives in the dark corners of the world, earning a silver star for dragging men out of burning Humvees under fire. She had come to the quiet hospital to find peace, to heal without the sound of gunfire, and to live a life where no one knew her as a warrior. She had taken the mocking and the insults of the staff because, after what she had seen, their words were nothing but wind. The next morning, the atmosphere in the hospital had shifted. There was no whispering. There was no mocking. When Clara walked into the break room to get a cup of coffee, the veteran nurses stood up. Miller, her face flushed with a mixture of shame and awe, approached her. I didn't know," Miller stammered. "Why didn't you tell us who you were? Why didn't you defend yourself?" Clara took a sip of her coffee, the same quiet light returning to her eyes. "Because you shouldn't have to be a hero to be treated with respect," she said softly. "I didn't come here to be a combat pro. I came here to be a nurse. Every patient in these beds is someone's high-value asset. If you only find strength in shouting, you'll never hear the people who actually need you." Clara stayed at St. Jude's, but things were different. She remained the quietest person in the room, but her silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. It was recognized as the quiet before the storm, the calm of a woman who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was capable of. The story of the mouse, who commanded the giants, became a legend in the halls, a reminder to everyone who worked there that the most powerful person in the room is often the one with the least to say. True greatness doesn't need an audience, it only needs a purpose.